There are 6 of us who make up the Institute for Studies of Religion. We're all called distinguished professors, which is wonderful. And 4 of us are here this morning, and it's my privilege to introduce the next of our distinguished members, Philip Jenkins. We all, of course, besides being at the Institute, have connections with some department, and Philip is also a distinguished professor of history at Baylor. He's not a native Texan, although he seems to be assimilating very rapidly. But he grew up in the United Kingdom. His degrees are from Cambridge. He came to the United States to Penn State. Briefly, he was a criminologist. As briefly, I was a sociologist, and then we became historians. And he's very, very well known for his very many books. But the 2 I think that really stand out are The Next Christianity and The New Faces of Christianity, which is all about the explosion of religion in what Philip calls the global South. Some of it really isn't south of the equator, but we make believe that India and places like that are part of the global South. He's also written a wonderful book on the Gnostic Gospels and is about to bring out his 2nd book on the Gnostic Gospels. So you see, he does get around, and Philip, it's your turn.
Yes, I'm the next in line among the extinguished professors here. I want to talk about the topic of godless Europe, and there's a query after that. And in a sense, Europe is the poster child for secularization. When people talk about secularization, they say, will the United States end up like Europe? Some years ago, I was writing a book called God's Continent about religion in Europe, and I often had the experience of saying, I'm writing a book about religion in Europe, and the standard joke was, it must be a very short book, ha ha ha. And so I got a little weary of hearing that, but sometimes you see surveys which put hard numbers on this, and they seem to suggest it. Not long ago at the American Physics Society, don't ask why, there was a survey which looked at census evidence and tried to predict those countries around the world which by the end of the present century would be wholly without religion. And it's a very interesting list. It began with Canada, Australia, New Zealand, but all the other countries, the other 9 of the 9 countries, were European. And let me see, what was it? Estonia, Austria, the Czech Republic, Switzerland, the Netherlands, and Ireland. I thought, Ireland, well, that's an interesting figure. And by the way, those are only the countries where the census evidence allowed you to make predictions like that. Almost certainly, by the methodology they were using, Britain would certainly have ended up on the list, and conceivably France. So it looks like the trends are very much downwards in that way. So are we looking at Europe as the end of religion? And I can certainly point to some very depressing, some very dramatic statistics. When you look, for instance, at several European countries, you can apply what I sometimes call the rule of 10, which is you look, for instance, at the number of people in Catholic seminaries back in 1960, and you compare it to today, and you divide by 10. And that's roughly the scale of the decline. Is there another case to be made? And yes, I think there is. And the first one is you have to apply a little bit of history. And so much of what I'm going to say, you're going to think I'm channeling Rod Stark because I'm repeating so many of his facts, but in a European context. And let's compare this with history. Once upon a time, I was in a cathedral. I was traveling through churches and cathedrals in Paris. And I did a count, and in the mid-19th century, 3 archbishops of Paris in a row got shot or executed, which sort of suggests that in the mid-19th century, there wasn't kind of total submissive religious loyalty, unless it involved some form of episcopal human sacrifice. I didn't say it was a bad idea. But the other point that I see, so history suggests that maybe we're starting from, if you like, a false initial starting point. But geography. Europe is an extremely varied place. It has some places which are far more religious than others. If you just look at Great Britain and the Netherlands, then you're going to get an exaggerated view of secularization. And even when church attendance falls in particular countries, religious loyalties remain very high. There are several countries which look exactly like the standard traditional image of the homogeneous, religiously loyal, religiously active areas of years gone by. A classic example is Poland, where you have seminaries as full as they have ever been, more full in many ways, and that's because in that country and other East European countries, religion came to be a badge of people who opposed communist dictatorship. It's very parallel in a lot of ways to China. If I look at Russia, there has been, if you like, a very unhealthy alliance in recent years of church and state between the Orthodox Church and the Putin regime. And some people have made some very critical comments about this. There's a nasty comment about the Orthodox Church in Russia that all it knows is how to be chaplain to the Tsar, and they don't care who's Tsar. And you can certainly criticize this, but there has been a major revival, restructuring of religion in Russia. It's going on before our eyes. It partly is seen in the physical reconstruction of so many cathedrals and monasteries that the Soviets destroyed. And monasteries with some of the most amazing stories. You look at some of the greatest Russian monasteries, which survived and flourished up to 1917. And then under the Bolsheviks, they deliberately chose them for the scenes of some of their worst atrocities. They became prison camps, they became prisons, they became execution grounds. And so you had the great monastery of Varlam, you had Optina Pustin. And then 1991 came, and they came back as very flourishing monasteries, which these days attract tens of thousands of people. So you can go to a place called Optina Pustin, for example, and you can literally tread in the footsteps of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, and you can go to the hermitages where Dostoevsky met the originals of characters he put in Brothers Karamazov, and you can see the latest incumbents there. So it looks almost as if Bolshevism, as if communism was a phase, and Holy Russia is back. Also, you look at Western Europe, and you see many places where you have state churches, in Scandinavia, for example, and your first thought is that numbers have declined enormously. You go to a country like Denmark, for example, or Norway, and you know two things. The comment everyone will make is, well, everyone loves the church, but nobody goes there. And when you press them a little bit on that, you hear something else, which is nobody goes there after confirmation. And what you find is, in these countries, confirmation in those Protestant churches is still an enormously popular, standard thing. It is what people are assumed to be doing. And I've had people in some of the most secular countries of Scandinavia assure me that the fact people don't go to churches is for one reason, which is they think they have internalized those values in their societies. They don't need to. That the belief is there, but the participation is not. One of the best European sociologists of religion is a British scholar called Grace Davey, and she has a great phrase about Britain, which is believing without belonging. Now in Scandinavia, you've got something a little bit different. People belong, but they don't participate. But the nature of that belonging, for an American, it can be almost uncanny going to one of these countries, because you see so much evidence of public, open Christianity in a way that would be absolutely unacceptable in a country that is so used to having its wars over Christmas. Well, in European countries, they don't have wars over Christmas, or Easter, or Pentecost. I was in Denmark a couple of years ago, and I was amazed that all the shops were shut. And I asked somebody, and he said, but it's General Prayer Day. And the big debate in Scandinavian countries is the 2 or 3 rule, which is when you have a great day like Pentecost or the Ascension, do people take 2 days off or 3 days off? Your year is structured around those religious holidays, and your cities are still structured around them. In every Paternoster row, every Holy Spirit street, every St. James's street. Do people actually understand what these mean? Maybe not. But that rhythm is there. Well, suppose I raise the point, well, maybe these are ghosts. Europe is a society of ghost religion, that they have these ideas, but they don't really count anymore. Let me suggest one very major way in which I think they do count. We today live in the golden age of European pilgrimage, far more so than in the Middle Ages. Compared to the Middle Ages, more Europeans today, a larger proportion, not raw numbers, a larger proportion, go on pilgrimages. More pilgrimage places exist, have been reconstructed or created anew in the last 30 years. And very much as Professor Stark was saying about Islam, you see this all over Europe. You look at shrines, great shrines, which in the 1950s might have been attracting 100,000, 500,000 people. These days are attracting 5 and 6 million people a year. Santiago de Compostela in Spain, Fatima, Lourdes. And these are, if you like, the superstar pilgrimage shrines. But all over Europe, there has been this great revival of pilgrimage places. Where you saw this, for example, was when communism fell in a country like Bulgaria. What was the first thing they did? They restored their great medieval shrine of Rila. In Poland, 15% of Poles go on a pilgrimage each year in secular Europe. And this is true across the continent. By the way, this is not particularly a measure of religiosity, but I sort of like it. In Greece, for example, the notional adherence to the Orthodox Church is astonishing. It's 90-something%. And the Greek government, I often confuse it with the Orthodox Church. The Greek government is still in negotiation as to whether it's going to allow a mosque to be built in Athens. And the negotiations are continuing, as they have done since 1938. Religious sentiment affects politics, but let's look at these pilgrimages. So I've mentioned them in places like Santiago, for example. Look at some of the new pilgrimage sites, like Medjugorje in the Balkans, great Catholic site. Between 1981, when it was created, and 2007, it attracted 30 million visitors. Places that we don't know well outside Europe, like Kevelaer on the German-Dutch border. Now that is the heart of European secularism, okay? The heart between Western Germany and the Netherlands. That is the malarial swamp of Orthodox religion. It attracts 800,000 pilgrims each and every year. And the other thing that's happened in the last 20 years, is the recreation of the pilgrimage routes. Let me explain this. We all know about pilgrimage places, okay? But roads always led to these places, and all along them there were churches, there were hostels, there were subsidiary monasteries, and so on. In the last 20 to 25 years, those have all returned. Those routes have all returned. And this is largely through European governments looking for tourist activities. People go hiking, people go on these long outdoor ventures. But there is this spiritual element, even in the oddest places. And recently, for instance, I was in Norway, where the great attraction there in recent years is what's called St. Olaf's Way. In the Middle Ages, you had the shrine of Nidaros in the city of Trondheim, and people would come there from all over northern Europe. In the last 20 years, they've identified St. Olaf's Way, and you can go to Nidaros over 3,000 miles of marked trails. If I was to stop the people there and said, is there a religious element, a spiritual element? Maybe yes, maybe no. How does that compare to the Middle Ages? If you ever read Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, were all the people there deeply pious and there for solely religious motives? Or were they tourists and out for day trips and whatever? By the way, it tells you all you need to know about European academe, that there's a wonderful series of books published on modern European pilgrimage by the firm of Routledge. And you can check it out if you go to their series on mental health. I do not joke. And that actually gets to a very important point. You know the biggest difference between Europe and the US in any kind of social policy? It is that Europe is a much more elitist society, and the elites have more control over media in pushing out their particular view. The US is a very conservative country on criminal justice. Sweden is a very liberal country. Nonsense. Sweden and the US have got very similar figures on how many people approve of capital punishment. It's just in Sweden they feel they can ignore what ordinary people think. Same is true with religion. You can have the president of France who will make a comment about, well, nobody in this country takes religion seriously. And somehow an awful lot of people in France do seem to go on pilgrimages and follow these different views. A couple of other things. Assume the worst possible case about secularization in Europe. I would suggest to you that secularization is a self-limiting process. Because over time, one of the commonest gauges of it is very sharply declining birth rates. Populations fall, you bring in more migrants, and those migrants tend to be much more religious. So much of the modern story of religion in Europe is one of migrant religion, and we think of Islam. Let's think of Christianity. The four largest mega-churches in Britain, and yes, there are mega-churches in secular Britain, are all pastored by black Africans, by sub-Saharan Africans. If you go to France or Belgium, also very high on the secularism list, they tend to be pastored by Congolese, by people from, again, black Francophone Africa. And I'm not even beginning to talk here about Islam as a phenomenon. How large a phenomenon will it be? Probably by the mid-century, about 15%. Don't believe any higher figures. And you will know when Islam has really seriously arrived on European soil when there start being Islamic pilgrimages to shrines in Europe, as starting to appear now in England. Also, we're seeing a reconstruction of many churches, many of the old churches that try to appeal to everyone, the old state churches, to aim at smaller, more committed bodies of believers to begin an evangelization of the whole from these small communities within the Anglican Church, within the Catholic Church, and they use this very standard biblical image of the leaven. We are like the yeast. This is one of the great ideas that was put forward, for instance, by Pope Benedict. And we see some effects of this recently. One of these movements within the Church of England is called, there's a parish called Holy Trinity Brompton, converted itself into basically what Americans would call a megachurch, and they devised a scheme of evangelizing that's based on the idea that people will know absolutely nothing. So what you do is you get together with them, you network, you get together for these dinner sessions, you hear these video presentations, you discuss them. And so far that venture, the Alpha course, something like, 50 million people have gone through it worldwide. And not long ago, a Roman Catholic cardinal described the Alpha course as the greatest gift of Protestants to Catholics since the Pentecostal movement. Now that demands a discuss after it. I was going to make 2 points very quickly. So Europe is this very secular place. You know, you wouldn't know that if you look at a couple of measures. Pilgrimage is an interesting one. Look at European culture, European film in recent years. I would suggest to you that in the last 5 to 10 years, Europe has produced a number of films which have achieved a very wide audience in their particular countries that are some of the greatest religious classics ever made. And I do not say since the religious days of the 1940s and 50s, I say ever. Look, for instance, at a film like the Russian film, The Island, which is about an Orthodox monastic community, which takes ideas of healing and exorcism absolutely seriously. Look at secular Finland, one of Europe's most secular countries. What was its great film in recent years? Letters to Father Jacob, about a Lutheran priest who is an intercessor. And it's a story of personal salvation. If you want to see a great religious classic that is also roll in the aisles funny, there's a wonderful one from Denmark called Mr. Vig and the Monastery, about a retired professor who wants to give his house, this is a true story, it's a documentary, to give his home to the Orthodox Church. And it's about the interaction between him and the Russian nun who turns up. And when you finish laughing, you realize what she's there for, which is she is not leaving this lunatic old man until she's saved his soul. And these stories of personal salvation, of community salvation, are so powerful. Michael Sheen, for example, one of Britain's greatest actors, was in a wonderful film called The Gospel of Us, which was basically a modern-day passion play. You look at European film today, you look at European architecture today, where are the great buildings? What are the great architects of today doing in Europe? And they're doing exactly what they were doing in 1650, which is they're turning out commissions for the church. And that's where European cutting-edge culture is. So, obviously, as the phrase goes, I can talk about this at some length. But when people say, are we going to end up like Europe? I would say the levels of belief, the levels of activity are still far, far higher than anyone gives credit for. And what has happened is a decline in the institutional structures. And what we see is, in most cases, believing without belonging. So, bottom line, yeah, I've been writing about religion in Europe. And you know, it's honestly not a short book. Anyway, I'll take questions if anyone wants to ask anything on that one. Please. And if you just wait for the mic there.
Would you please comment on the demographic trends in Europe and how that predicts the future of Christianity in Europe?
Yeah. Normally there's a close correlation, if you like, a negative correlation between fertility rates and particularly religious institutional practice. The more children you have, the higher fertility you have, then there's more kind of organized religious activity, and that's partly because there are more children around to put through First Communion classes or bar mitzvah training, people to get more connected to the institutions. When that declines, so you get that kind of correlation. European countries have got some of the world's lowest fertility rates. And in countries like Italy, Spain, Ireland, you follow a very nice little correlation between the fertility rates, which are now as low in Italy and Spain as anywhere in the world, and religious practice. What is interesting, though, is the decline in religious practice, actual like mass attendance, is not reflected in levels of religious belief. In other words, people are believing without belonging, and that's the shift. What happens over time, as I say, is the population shrinks, ages, and they need more people in from other countries to pay the taxes and do the jobs. Well, they used to get them from countries like Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia, which are three of the countries with sharpest falling birth rates. And now, don't you know, to find people to do that work, they're going to get more and more immigrants from Christian black Africa. So the demographics is a large part of this story, but it doesn't correspond, as I say, to a decline in religious belief, but maybe in the orthodox institutional religious organizations. Please, back there.
Excuse me.
Earlier in your discussion, you talked about some of the countries that would be on the list from the physics survey that said that they'd be no longer religious. You mentioned the Czech Republic, and then later you talk about Poland being one on the opposite side, even though they were both equally under the control of the Russian and the communist regime. One you said was stood up part of the religious counterculture to the political movement there was the Christianity or the religious where, Can you explain why they would be different?
Yeah. It's interesting. I mentioned the example of Poland as a very high religiosity place. The other example I could have chosen was Slovakia. So you used to have Czechoslovakia, okay? And Slovakia, which was Catholic, remains very, very Catholic. And when you get like disputes in the European courts over abortion or gay marriage, it's always Slovakia that's saying, no, we're not going to do that. The difference appears to be in several countries that the Protestant churches, as you had in the Czech Republic, Czech Protestant societies have been much more open to secularization. So, Catholics withstood that a lot better. Now, there are a couple of exceptions there, Austria and Ireland. But in the case of Estonia and the Czech Republic, what you're seeing is countries with very strong Protestant backgrounds. In fact, I sometimes say that when you look at that list of the countries that are going to be most secularized, if you take it seriously, then you know two things as major factors in secularization. One, ever having been a member of the British Empire, and two, ever having known the name of John Calvin. Netherlands, Switzerland. So I think the difference between the Czech Republic and Slovakia, which, by the way, is a terrific subject for someone to do a comparative study of, is largely a contrast between Protestant established churches and Catholic established churches. I will take one more quick one if anyone has a gentleman over here. Could you just wait 1 second for the mic? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, it's this gentleman here. Please excuse me.
I see a lot of things from the UN where the religious emphasis is being put on the creation rather than the creator, and that seems to be a trend. Is that correct? Am I wrong in that?
Could you explain that a little bit? I don't quite understand that.
Well, with the Greenie movement, where people are concerned about saving the earth, those kind of things, And I see even children in school that get more of a worshiping the Creator or the creation rather than the Creator. And that's old-fashioned, the Creator.
Mm. Yeah, clearly environmentalism has a very strong religious content. Many of us would say, in terms of the literature on climate change, it also has developed its own wing of apocalyptic sentiment. Maybe people are going to speak the language of religion even if they don't believe it. But one lesson that I get very strongly is when you look at elite global institutions like the United Nations, I never know who they're representing except for themselves, and they're not speaking for their countries or the populations in their countries, and that's never more true than in the UN. My colleague mentioned